a special presentation. This is News 8, celebrating 70 years.
Welcome to News 8's 70th anniversary special. News 8 celebrating 70 years. I'm Ann Nyberg.
And I'm Keith Kuntz. This is going to be a great time. Over the next hour, we're going to be taking a little step back in time, celebrating Connecticut's great history and our history as well, all the way back to the beginning of Connecticut's oldest TV station.
Where we once lifted weights and rode exercise bikes in an Action News 8 ad. The production department called this Anchors Away.
I remember that like yesterday. It was back to a time when I spent a lot more of my time out in the field rather than being behind the anchor desk.
This is going to be an hour of nostalgia. A look at the past, the highs, the lows, the triumphs, the tragedies.
More highs than lows, and how we have grown here at News 8, Connecticut's first TV station. News 8's Ken Pierce has done a remarkable job over the past month and a half piecing together all of our great history. Let's start with a look back at the very beginning in the late 1940s and 50s.
June 15th, 1948, WNHC went on the air as Channel 6. The driving force behind it, a quirky Italian immigrant named Aldo Di Domenicis. He sold pasta to Italian markets around New Haven. Then he started buying radio time during Italian shows and sold that too.
He would go out and sell the advertisement along with the olive oil and the pasta and so on. That was his package.
Enzo and Dante are Aldo's nephews. Darren Kramer interviewed them for News 8's Italian Week in 2015. They say their uncle convinced the Dumont television network to give him the equipment to start a station for almost nothing, promising they would sell a bunch of TV sets in Connecticut. It was the only TV station in Connecticut at the time, so every network fought to get its shows on Aldo's air.
He would get phone calls. ABC, oh, Aldo, would you carry our program tonight? Or CBS, no, wait a minute, I have the fight going, so I promised that I would carry the fight.
While Aldo got the station on the air, a dashing photographer named Jack Youngs became Connecticut's first TV field photographer, shooting everything from movie stars like Jane Mansfield to the top stories of the decade. Here he is alongside police during a shootout. He covered Joseph Mad Dog Taborski, who was sentenced to death twice, the second time after a 6-week killing spree claimed 6 lives and terrified the state. Young's most impressive feat may have been his coverage of the Great Flood of August 1955. What was left of 2 different hurricanes dumped 2 feet of rain on parts of the state.
Tried to save some of my mother's furniture, but we had to leave that and go upstairs to the 2nd floor, and the water was still rising, and we finally went up in the attic.
Spent the night there with our children with their life jackets on, wondering if we would have to make a dive for it.
Years later, Jack Youngs told the story of how he made his way up the Naugatuck Valley, shooting the devastation and convincing strangers to drive his film back.
Everybody was gawking at the storm, but they weren't in danger, not unless they were in the path of the storm. So they would take the film for me.
It was washed down the river?
Well, it wasn't washed down the river, but a house fell on top of it.
Well, it's just as bad.
That reporter was Sid Jaffe. He didn't just cover news, but top sports figures as well, like the groundbreaking baseball player Jackie Robinson.
What are the chances for the Brooklyn Dodgers for 1954?
Sid, they look very good.
Another TV legend, George Thompson, was often by Jack's side, covering all the top stories. In happier news, WNHC had Happy the Clown, a kids show starting in 1952. Happy's real name was Joey Russell.
Everything was in the basement back in those days.
His son Jake says his father was working as a stand-up comic, and some station executives saw him in a club.
And talked my dad into putting on a clown suit and doing an audition.
Joey Russell played a TV clown for years, with Jake and his siblings sometimes joining the live audience.
I remember the cameraman was telling me, you can't be over here, you're in the shot, you gotta get over here, you gotta get over here. So I remember being behind the scenes.
He and everyone else at WNHC were learning how TV worked because no one in Connecticut had done it before. By the time the 50s were over, the station had switched to Channel 8.
And that brings us to the 1960s, our first full decade on the air.
A tumultuous time for America and in Connecticut.
The 1960s began with the final chapter to one of the biggest stories of the 50s. Joseph Mad Dog Taborski killed 7 people in a string of armed robberies. He became the last person put to death in Old Sparky, the state's electric chair, May 17th, 1960.
His last meal, a banana split, a cherry cola, and a cup of coffee.
Keith Kuntz reported on the execution years later because it would be another 45 years before Connecticut would execute another prisoner. In 1961, Governor Abe Ribicoff resigned to join John F. Kennedy's cabinet as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. A year and a half later, he left the cabinet and got elected to the first of 3 terms in the U.S. Senate. As the U.S. got more and more involved in Vietnam, Yale chaplain William Sloane Coffin led anti-war demonstrations. Some young men enlisted, while protests against recruiters at stores turned violent. Covering all these stories was not easy when everything was shot on film.
And this was one of the cameras the news photographers used to use. I don't know if we can pick up the sound on it, but this is the battery. It turned crank.
Some former Channel 8 employees still get together for breakfast once a month. They remember the perils of putting together stories on film.
Because many times the glue that held the film together would break, and all of a sudden, boom, you'd have no story anymore.
Longtime anchor and news director Bob Norman described one broadcast for our 50th anniversary special.
Stand by 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2. The film broke. Good evening.
Joining Bob in the studio in the 60s, longtime sports director Dick Galliette.
This is what it's all about.
He would stay for 20 years, then went on to cover Yale on the radio. Gail Carroll was one of the first weather girls. Yes, that's what they were called. She was one of the first women in the nation to forecast the weather on TV.
We used to do a lot of live programming, obviously because there was no videotape or computers.
Oh, there it is right over there.
The best known was Friends of Mr. Goober.
Everybody watched Mr. Goober. To be on Mr. Goober was a huge privilege, you know. Not many kids got to do it.
Mike Warren played Mr. Goober, the owner of a general store. He told some jokes.
You must never pay to see a fish dance. Says it's usually a flop.
And he would play cartoons. That's where engineer Frank Lowski would step in.
And that's where I got my nickname, Turn the Crank Frank. Because when he wanted a cartoon to run, he would say, turn the crank, Frank, and I would hit the projector button, and then the cartoon would roll, and we'd put it on the air.
The ratings were just through the roof. Just absolutely through the roof.
Warren was more than just Mr. Goober. He hosted Connecticut Bandstand and Dialing for Dollars. It was a different kind of entertainer who made headlines in New Haven in 1967. Another band found Jim Morrison of The Doors in their bathroom with a groupie at the old New Haven Arena. Singer Tommy Jeanette called in a police officer.
As he's shaking the mace, he says, this is your last chance to evacuate the property and leave. And Morrison turned around and said, this is your last chance to eat me, and pushed the cop.
Morrison got maced, later swore on stage, and became the first rock star arrested while performing. The 60s ended with a suspected police informant being tortured in this New Haven home, then murdered by members of the Black Panthers in May of 1969. The trial would cause chaos the next year, a fitting end to the turbulent decade of the 60s.
On our actual anniversary, June 15th, we invited many News 8 alumni, whom many of you will remember, for a special celebration. We even had cake.
That was some kind of an afternoon. We asked them to share with us some of their greatest memories. Here's former reporter, weatherman, and anchor, Ken Bennett.
I have friends to this day that I worked with in the early 70s and into the 80s and with high school bowl into the 90s. It's like a brotherhood and a sisterhood rolled into one.
And welcome back. We showed you how it all began here at News 8 and took you through our first decade on the air.
Now we'll look at the 70s. Kent Pierce recalls what stories came into your living rooms then.
The 1970s saw one of the biggest events in New Haven history. Members of the Black Panther Party on trial in connection with the murder of a fellow Panther accused of being an FBI informant.
And we covered it on the green every day, and about where this tent is was called the Pig Pen. This is where the press was.
The accused included National Party Chairman Bobby Seale, so it became a national story. 10,000 people packing the green each day, and Ken Bennett was right there.
The Black Panthers and all kinds of radicals would come each morning, and they would talk out here.
Charges against Seale were dropped. Other members got prison time, and it all happened just a couple blocks from WNHC's building on College Street.
It was an exciting time because part of the reason I was brought here was they were going to do this thing called Action News.
From Channel 8, Connecticut's leading news station, this is Action News.
How do you provide energy? How do you provide interest? How do you provide excitement, action Action News, you know, Channel 8 Action News.
In April of 1971, Channel 8 Action News was sold to Capital Cities. At the time, it was the biggest broadcasting deal in history. Cap Cities changed the call letters to WTNH. 2 months later came the worst plane crash in Connecticut history. Allegheny Airlines Flight 485 from Washington to Tweed, New Haven.
I had gone to Washington that weekend, and I was scheduled to come back on that Monday morning flight. I came back on Sunday night.
George Grand was working for WNHC Radio at the time. The Monday morning flight crashed just short of the Tweed runway and caught fire, killing 28 people on board.
The jet fuel and the sirens, it's something that'll never leave you.
Grand left radio for TV, becoming part of the team with Gail Janis, Cheryl Preble, and Dick Galliette. He was working the weekend in April 1975 when men broke in and firebombed Shelton's sponge rubber factory. He rushed to get the story on the air at 11.
Which, of course, was the biggest case of arson in United States history. We had the story before anybody else.
The court cases regarding that fire took years to sort out. 2 murders from the 70s went unsolved for decades. In July of 73, 22-year-old Concetta Penny Serra was stabbed to death in New Haven's Temple Street garage. It would be 24 years before her killer would be caught. In October of 75, 15-year-old Martha Moxley was murdered with a golf club near her Greenwich home. The case against neighbor Michael Skakel is still in the courts.
Hello, Tambusi, wrestle!
In November of 1974, Ella Grasso made history as the first woman elected governor of a state in her own right. At the end of the decade, it was weather making headlines. The morning after a heavy snowfall in January 1978, the roof of the Hartford Civic Center collapsed just hours after a UConn basketball game. No one was hurt.
Effective at 10 o'clock tonight, I am ordering that all roads and highways in our state be closed.
In February, the blizzard of 78 shut down the whole state with up to 30 inches of snow.
Oh, we got an accident down there.
It was Ken Vennett's job to go out on those closed roads, finding the people who were stuck.
My wife wanted to know why I could go everywhere in the state except home, where she had 2 babies to take care of, and it's just the way things were.
A very different kind of weather hit northern Connecticut in October of 1979.
The damage was just unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable, as you see here.
While the news brought you right to the action, Action News also helped create some great TV personalities.
I'm Mike Boguslawski, and I'm in your corner.
For nearly 2 decades, Mike Boguslawski fought for the little guy. Darren Kramer caught up with Bogey just last year, and he talked about the viewer response.
Bags of mail. I read every single letter.
Ken Vennett created the Yankee Traveler series, and along the way, got to do everything from parasailing to wrestling a bear.
When you're in your 20s and it's called Action News, you do a lot of things.
This is Ken Vennett, Action News. In Hamden.
Just one of the hard-hitting stories from Action News in the 1970s.
And time to share some more memories from some former News 8 staff. Up next, a couple of sports guys.
But that's not all they did. Here's what Mike Elliott and Skip Church remember most from their time here at WTNH.
I miss the people. I miss the creativity. I kind of miss the deadlines because everything you guys do every day is high energy. I mean, you know, time does not wait. You got to be ready. You got to be prepared.
Probably overall the biggest memory is how exciting it was because we added the 5 o'clock, we added the 5:30, we had a great anchor team, the repertorial staff was unbelievable. I met my wife at a live shot, so it doesn't get much better than that.
Welcome back. The 1980s, a very big decade for Ann and me for several reasons. One of them, it was the decade we both began here at News 8.
But it was also a decade of tragedy. Kent Pierce looks at those 10 years.
The 1980s began with sad news. In March of 1980, Ella Grasso, the first woman in the U.S. elected governor in her own right, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer.
Those of us in the media knew she was dying. You know, she stepped aside in favor of Lieutenant Governor O'Neill at the end of 1980.
Grasso died 5 weeks after she resigned. The funeral was packed and emotional.
And then they allowed everybody to go up, the public, after all the officials had done it, go up, touch the casket, and say goodbye. And I was able to do that, so it was a very personal moment for me.
July 5th, 1982 was another sad day. An arsonist burned down an apartment building in Waterbury. Photographer George DeYoung had just started at Channel 8.
Bad fire. I think it was 6 children. 2 or 3 adults.
The count actually grew to 14 dead. The man who set the fire spent the rest of his life in prison. Diane Smith's first day at Channel 8 was in October of 1982. She covered a toll protest on I-95 by a Republican candidate for governor, Louis Rome. It was causing a traffic backup, and a state trooper showed up to investigate.
So the trooper goes back to his car and comes back and says, "My orders are if you don't leave, I have to arrest you." At which point, Mr. Rome turned to me, the only reporter there, and said, "If you arrest us, you have to arrest this reporter from Channel 8, too."
Which he did on her memorable first day. Tolls became an even bigger story in January of '83 with a horrific crash in Stratford.
Truck driver slammed into a row of cars waiting to pay their tolls, and 7 people were killed, incinerated on the spot.
To keep it from happening again, the state got rid of all tolls.
And that's when we got the hike in the gas tax. That was the compromise. Do away with the tolls, we're going to have a very high gas tax.
It was part of a string of Connecticut disasters that changed safety rules. The next involved the bridge carrying I-95 over the Mianus River in Greenwich.
And this bridge until 1:30 this morning was safe. Well, as of 1:30, it was in the river.
That was June 28, 1983. 3 people died when the bridge just fell away underneath them.
It was just one big chunk that just went boom like that and took people with it, and it was absolutely horrendous. And I think for months I covered something relating to the Mianus River bridge collapse.
And for years, bridge inspection regulations changed around the country. In December of 1985, the River Restaurant in Derby exploded, killing 6. Crews installing a new sewer line ruptured an old gas main. The state started its Call Before You Dig campaign as a result. And in April 1987, an apartment building under construction in Bridgeport collapsed.
69 people were working on the scene when the collapse happened. 41 of those people are accounted for at this hour.
Workers were using a process called lift slab to build L'Ambiance Plaza.
Those are the kind of stories during my career that really it never gets out of your system.
Late great photographer Pat Child talked about it on our 50th anniversary.
And there's all this, the hope that stayed alive for days and days and days and days and days of, oh, we're going to find somebody, we're going to find somebody, I got down there, I took a look at that, I said, nobody lived through this thing.
Nobody did. 28 construction workers died as the levels pancaked on top of each other, and lift slab construction was banned for good. In 1984, police caught serial killer Michael Ross. He grew up killing chickens on his family's farm, then moved on to rape and murder. He confessed to killing 8 women, and a jury sentenced him to death.
As you can see, trees back there have been snapped off like matchsticks.
Nature did plenty of damage, too. In 1985, Hurricane Gloria made landfall near Westport.
We're going to go now to Jeff Fox. He's standing by up in the Action News Weather Center, and we'll have an update now on Gloria. Jeff.
Yes, Al. Been taking a look at all the latest.
Fortunately, Gloria hit at low tide, so she was not nearly as destructive as she could have been.
There's the post office.
Not so the tornado of July 1989.
From the Litchfield Hills, the storm continued its inexorable march to the sea.
Channel 8 was the first station in Connecticut to get a helicopter. Anchor Al Terzi went up in it to describe the tornado's destruction. Tim Clune was the photographer.
And you could see where it touched down, and it just went back and forth, and it looked like footprints.
In the middle of all that news, Channel 8 moved into its current building, 8 Elm Street, during one weekend in 1983.
It was a real ordeal. It lasted over 24 hours where, you got no sleep.
We had been in a very small claustrophobic studio in our other building, so this was enormous, and we didn't really exactly know what to do with all that space.
So part of the studio was rented out to a talk show. Before Oprah, the queen of daytime was Sally Jessy Raphael.
Interfaith marriages on the next Sally.
Last year, we talked with Sally about the early years of her show.
I think New Haven did form me and get me ready for New York.
Oh, Sally Jessy, that was a lot of fun. Yeah, getting the live audience and having them line up.
Celebrities like Sammy Davis Jr. would roam the station's hallways. He would come to Connecticut every year because he was the name behind the Greater Hartford Open Golf Tournament.
Celebrity Pro-Am Day was unbelievable. In one day, not only did I interview Sammy Davis Jr., Jerry Lewis, Bob Hope, the list just goes on and on.
So does the list of Channel 8 reporters and anchors. Skip Church did sports, then was a featured reporter.
It was a really exciting time in the 80s. We were adding newscasts, the 5:30, the 5 o'clock. We had a great anchor team. The repertorial staff was unbelievable.
Janet Peckinpah?
You mean Peckinpah?
Oh. Hey, I saw you on the news last night.
Channel 8 promoted its anchors and expanded news to catch people who were home by 5 p.m.
And that's how the early shows started in the afternoon, and they were as you know, quite popular. So it was a hit, and all the other stations started doing it.
So I came here in, I want to say it was September of '87.
Some of the faces you still see today came here in the 1980s.
1987 was a different time in television news.
A time when anchors did ads in spandex and shows ended with people giving thumbs up for action news. It may seem dated now, but we still get the thumbs up today. So much that happened in the 1980s still affects our lives.
That'll do it for Action News.
Al and Ann, Action News at 5, 6, and 11.
Wow. Speaking of the 1980s, that was me alongside Al Terzi, another familiar face at News 8.
And a familiar face for Connecticut news in general. I sat down with Al earlier this month. He shared some of his memories here at WTNH.
This place, I tell you, had some of the best years of my whole career. The most fun years. I was very busy. Not long after I got here, I was off to the national political conventions, both in Detroit and New York. That's the one in Detroit was the one where President Reagan was nominated. I remember going to the Danbury, Brewster, New York area when they had a rash of UFO sightings in the Hudson Valley of New York back in the 80s. So I did that. And just a lot of great stories.
The 1980s saw the birth of a special segment dedicated to children in Connecticut in need of foster care or adoption.
It was so much fun. That segment was for years called Thursday's Child. It was put together by a variety of people here at News 8, including myself. Eventually, it transitioned into Wednesday's Child. In the mid-2000s, former News 8 Special Projects Director Veronica Douglas was the face of Wednesday's Child. The purpose, though, always remained the same: to find good homes for children of all ages who are waiting and hoping to be adopted. And over the years, we are so very proud to say Wednesday's Child helped accomplish that for hundreds of children.
It's important.
Back now to another former News 8 anchor sharing with us some memories of the news biz.
Here's Pat Sheehan on what he misses about being in a newsroom back in the day.
I miss there being a common conversation that would go on in the state. Newspapers were stronger. The headlines would be things that everybody was sharing. These days, people get to self-select what they want to hear, what they don't want to hear. And I think it's a different world.
This was my favorite place to be, and it was because we were a family. I mean, the news director's office was over in the corner, and we were on the set, and the reporters were all in the news director's office every single night. They would not go home, not because he made them, because they wanted to see their product, and they were so proud. We were all so proud of what we were doing, and we were coming from way from behind. So we had nowhere to go but up, and we did it.
As I was arriving to News 8 in January of 1987, remember that?
I do, yes.
That's when you came to.
Quite well.
News anchor Janet Peckinpah would be leaving in June of that year, but not before she made an indelible mark as the girl next door in Connecticut. We have stayed in touch all these years.
And on to the 1990s and more stories of promises, politics, and also prison time. Ken Pierce captures those moments in time.
In 1990, the big story was the race for governor. Former Senator Lowell Weicker won a three-way race for governor, and former anchor Diane Smith says he made a promise.
During his campaign, he said very clearly he would not start an income tax.
But there was a national recession, according to Chief Capitol correspondent Mark Davis.
And in his first State of the State address, he proposed an income tax.
After months of budget negotiations, the tax passed.
Axe the tax! Axe the tax!
When it took effect, it spurred the largest protest ever at the Capitol.
It was enormous. And Weicker walked right through the crowd, and there was this. I'd never heard so many boos in my life.
It was the start of another great run in 1992 when the Mashantucket Pequots expanded their popular bingo hall into a full-fledged casino. It was not easy.
When I first went out to what's now Foxwoods, it was one elderly woman living in a trailer, literally, and she hung on to that land fiercely.
4 years later, Mohegan Sun opened its doors. Slot revenue from both fed hundreds of millions of dollars into the state's coffers, but not enough to get rid of the income tax, not even when John Rowland promised to in 1994.
Rowland ran on the platform of repealing the income tax.
So he was a rising political star, and I watched him win election, and he won 3 terms, which had not been done by any modern times governor.
Channel 8 lost one of its stars in 1993, reporter Ellen Abrams.
Crime stories were her passion. She was an incredible storyteller, a great reporter, and a great friend.
Photographer Keith Porter often worked with Ellen and had spent the past few days covering a big snowstorm.
She went out jogging that morning, that Tuesday morning, and she was hit by a car, and she had died on scene.
Ellen Abrams was just 33. More snow made headlines 3 years later. The winter of 95-96 is still the snowiest in history. One storm in January dropped more than 30 inches in Litchfield County. In July of 1996, Milo Sheff celebrated the state Supreme Court decision in Sheff versus O'Neill. It declared the state had to desegregate its schools. Connecticut is still struggling with exactly how.
Nobody should ever have to go through this.
In March of 1998, a disgruntled accountant working at state lottery headquarters shot and killed 4 people, then turned the gun on himself. On December 4th of 1998, Yale student Suzanne Joven was found stabbed to death 2 miles from campus.
When something random happens like this, it's very scary.
No arrests were ever made, and just last year, police announced they were reopening the case using new technology to analyze evidence. By the late 90s, people were not just getting Channel 8 stories on their TVs.
WTNH.com was the first news website in Connecticut before any other media outlet.
The initial site may look pretty simple today,
but state-of-the-art for its time in the late 90s.
The 90s were also big for sports in Connecticut. Skip Church had been covering the Special Olympics for years.
When I first got here, I did 3 features on individuals and families who were involved in Special Olympics.
And in 1995, the World Games came to New Haven.
Sails looking underneath for Lobo.
That same year, Gino Auriemma started a trend for UConn basketball.
Well, the Huskies arrived here in Minneapolis yesterday.
The Huskies went undefeated and won their first NCAA championship.
Langdon trips, and UConn has done it!
The men's team followed suit in 1999.
I can remember just actually having goosebumps when the final horn went off and they walked off with a national championship.
Sports director John Pearson started as an intern helping cover the Hartford Whalers. In April of 1997, he had to cover the state's only pro sports team leaving.
At any moment, I might just start bawling.
Then sports fans got some great news in 1998.
The New England Patriots will play their first home game in Hartford in the fall of 2001.
In a $500 million stadium on the river.
I never thought it was going to happen. You know, I thought all along we were just being used.
Connecticut was being used by owner Robert Kraft to leverage a better deal in Massachusetts. John Rowland always sounded confident.
In terms of career accomplishments, I would say it has to be in the top 3.
And then he said, I bet my political career on it that they're coming to Connecticut.
Also throwing cold water on Connecticut was the remains of Hurricane Floyd in September of 1999. Some parts of Connecticut got 15 inches of rain.
Transmitted 5.
New technology helped Channel 8 bring you all those stories. Chopper 8 got gyroscopic cameras, and we used it more than ever.
You would be doing a story in New Haven, and they say, look, we need you to do an interview in Danbury. Go meet the helicopter, and you got to fly to Danbury.
Satellite technology allowed crews to leave the state and even the country.
If there's something that had a Connecticut connection, they would fly you to Europe, to California.
Behind me is the Hanoi Training Stadium.
Kevin Hogan went to Vietnam with a Waterbury priest who brought Connecticut athletes to communist countries.
This is the entrance to Kensington Palace.
Wendy Cicchetti covered Princess Diana's funeral. Photographer Tim Clune remembers the raw emotion.
Grown men standing outside of the Abbey and just bawling.
Iglesias de Carmen is located in the very busy central Havana area.
And Ann Nyberg went to Cuba.
I was there with Tom Manning, and they confiscated his tape because we left Havana and did some stuff on our own, but that's when the Pope came, and that was a big deal.
It was a big deal one day when Diane Smith talked to her boss about positive stories.
He says, we're going to cover more good news. I said, great. Get up to leave, and he said, and that's your job. You're going to cover one good news story every single week.
That turned into Positively Connecticut.
Most reporters don't get the chance to cover a story from beginning to end, not when there's 10 years in between.
She wrote books and continued the series even after she left Channel 8.
That's the tax!
The taxes and tragedies, storm damage, and sports disappointments meant we all needed something positive to get through the 1990s.
What a decade. Now we hear from longtime sports director Bob Picozzi.
Here are a few of his memories at 8.
The camaraderie,
you know, just working in a unit of a newsroom and getting to be very close with the people, and I still remain very good friends with them. So, you know, a job's a job, but, you know, friendships last forever. Diane Smith is one of my closest friends on earth. Stay in touch with her all the time, so that's easily what I remember most.
The year 2000, it was a big one for many reasons. We kicked off a new millennium.
Here's a look at that decade.
As the new millennium began, there were concerns about the Y2K bug.
Everybody was worried about, you know, things going haywire, so that was a big night.
It turns out there were no problems, so the state got ready for what would become a tradition.
And Connecticut has done it.
The Yukon women won their second national championship in 2000. 2000 also meant Upsail in July, which News Channel 8 brought to you from the beach, the water, and the air. It was impressive, but the biggest show of the year started in August.
On the word that we have been getting from sources within the Gore campaign that it is actually down to 2 individuals.
At a rally in Nashville, Vice President Al Gore announced Senator Joe Lieberman would be his running mate.
He had appealed to both parties. He was the first Jew ever nominated by a major political party.
News Channel 8 sent crews all over the country with him.
To me, it was exciting, you know. So you actually had to separate the excitement from, we have to do a job, we have to do work, we still have deadlines.
And we went, I think it was 96 hours nonstop without sleep. I hadn't done that since college. You know, it was just unbelievable. We did like 12 cities. We was zipping across the country.
On election night, with crews at both campaign headquarters, a sudden change from the network.
Something came on the big TV screen down here. I couldn't really tell what it was, but the crowd went nuts.
Florida is back in play. You remember?
Mark Davis was there as the Florida recount went on for weeks until the U.S. Supreme Court stopped it, making George W. Bush president. Back in Connecticut, May of 2001 saw the latex foam fire in Ansonia.
At the time, we had the only helicopter in Connecticut, and that day it was such a powerful tool.
This, at this point, is still a huge fire.
Ansonia lost its biggest employer. It seemed like the story of the year until September. The news director told Darren Kramer something was going on in New York.
And we both looked at the TV monitor that was on my desk, and we watched the second plane live hit the building together. Unreal.
161 people from Connecticut died that day. Many more had close calls.
And I opened the door of the conference room and I saw the plane go by and people falling.
And so many Connecticut families, Connecticut workers, you know, affected by that tragedy. That was, you know, very emotional, tough story to cover.
Another tough story was the 2001 arrest of Waterbury Mayor Phil Giordano.
Special Agent T with the FBI.
Can you tell me what's going on inside, sir?
Aaron Cox was the Waterbury Bureau reporter.
The FBI had wiretaps on Mr. Giordano because it was believed that there may have been some quid pro quo and maybe that he was taking bribes.
What they heard on the wiretaps was much worse. Giordano arranging to have a prostitute bring him 2 young girls to molest. A jury found him guilty on 17 counts. While that was making its way through the courts,
39-0, Connecticut is perfect.
The Yukon women won their 3rd championship on the basketball court. Back in the court of law, 2002 saw Kennedy cousin Michael Skakel on trial for the murder of neighbor Martha Moxley from 1975. A jury found him guilty.
I'm not here to start dissing the judge. I think errors may have been made.
People are still debating whether attorney Mickey Sherman provided an adequate defense or was playing to the cameras.
He provided comment and summary to that large media gathering every day. So some people might question whether his focus was in the right place.
In 2003, the mayor of Bridgeport went on trial. Joe Gannon was accused of getting hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and gifts in exchange for steering city contracts to certain companies.
This is not an easy or fun process for anybody who's ever been involved, and I wish it on no one.
Gannon would sit at the defense table in the morning, then go back and run the city every afternoon until a jury convicted him on 16 counts, sending him to prison for 7 years. In the middle of that trial came one of the biggest storms of the decade.
Meteorologists started with us just last week, and now look what we have thrown you into.
Gil Simmons had just joined News Channel 8.
And the coworkers that I thought initially liked me didn't even want to talk to me after that.
All that snow was forgotten in April when
they did it.
The Yukon women won their 4th national championship.
Gino Rama is one of the greatest coaches ever, period. Men's, women's, no matter what. what they've done up there is probably never going to be duplicated.
Gino Auriemma made women's basketball so popular in Connecticut, the Mohegan Tribe brought a WNBA team to Mohegan Sun in 2003.
And that's going to do it.
The very next year, the men won their second national title, and the very next night,
UConn wins 3 national championships in a row. The men and women have done it in the same year.
While the victory parade was going around the Capitol in Hartford, lawmakers inside were working on the impeachment of Governor John Rowland. Then in June of 2004,
I will officially step down as governor.
6 months later, he pled guilty to not paying taxes on gifts from state contractors and was sentenced to a year in prison. By 2005, serial killer Michael Ross had already been in prison for 30 years for killing 8 women. He gave up on his appeals, and on May 13th, as anti-death penalty protesters gathered outside the prison, he became the only person executed in Connecticut in the past 60 years.
A wall of water well over 10 feet high washed away everything on the ground floor.
Later that year, Hurricane Katrina battered the Gulf Coast.
Everything I owned was in that rubble pile.
News Channel 8 was there to tell the stories of loss and of the folks from Connecticut there to help.
It really made you think, you know, and we had our own ways of getting through the days, but it was tough.
In January 2007, some intentional destruction in New Haven. The Elm City imploded the Coliseum. 35 years of concerts and sports blown up to make way for a parking lot.
It began as a home invasion.
In July of 2007, a home invasion robbery in Cheshire turned into a gruesome murder. Erin Cox remembers her first live report on the scene.
The neighbors were gathered behind the camera, and they were hearing me say that there were 3 fatalities and 1 survivor. And I could hear the gasps.
It was robbery, rape, arson, and murder, all in an upscale suburb.
I think that made some people think about getting protection for themselves in their house who didn't have those worries before.
The trial of the 2 parolees caught at the scene would shape the state's death penalty debate in the coming decade. But let's end the decade with the other court. Because in 2009, the UConn women won their 6th national title, with many more to come in the next decade.
In the early 2000s, Anna Saba left the anchor desk to become a mother.
She worked alongside Darren Kramer. She recalls wrestling with her decision to leave broadcast news.
Just to be sentimental, the day I left, my very last day, my last broadcast with you, which still makes me beklempt. I think once you're a reporter, you're always a reporter. It's just in your blood and your bones. Of course I miss it.
Well, finally, we have made it to the 2010s. The last 7 years have been full of news stories that are still so fresh in our memories.
Kent Pierce brings us to present day.
78-0. Connecticut has won the national championship again.
2010 began with more success for UConn women's basketball, storming their way to a 2nd straight title in April. But in June, a different kind of storm in Bridgeport.
If you look behind me, you can see the house, its roof blown off by the strong winds.
A rare shoreline tornado ripped through the Park City, tearing apart homes and businesses alike.
Even if you go through there today, you can still see some evidence of when that came through all the way back in 2010.
In August of 2010, it was a beer distributor in Manchester that made national headlines.
Did he used to work there? Yeah, till I just fired him. Today? Today, just now before he started shooting.
The company fired Omar Thornton when he was caught on video stealing. He opened fire, killing 8 bosses and co-workers, then himself.
Tragedy to trial, front page.
Another killer went on trial in October of 2010.
The Pettit family comes to court putting...
Stephen Hayes was convicted and then sentenced to death for his part in the Cheshire home invasion killings of Jennifer Hawk Pettit and her daughters. Reporters like Erin Cox had the option of viewing the evidence photos.
You have to hear the testimony every day in court, and I felt that for Michaela and Haley and Mrs. Pettit, I also had to look at those horrible, horrible evidence photos.
The 2010 election started a decade-long trend of millionaires like Linda McMahon and Tom Foley running for political office. McMahon ran for Senate twice, losing both times.
Tom Foley's case, he came close, running against Malloy.
The governor's race came down to a recount in Bridgeport, which Foley lost. He lost to Malloy again in 2014.
These millionaire candidates here just didn't work.
And the Huskies are the top dog
in 2011.
In April 2011, the Yukon men's basketball team won big. In a tournament full of upsets, they won their third NCAA title under coach Jim Calhoun, who retired the next year.
The winds here in Westbrook keep getting stronger and stronger.
August brought Irene.
The support for this stairwell is gone.
Downgraded to a tropical storm before it got to Connecticut, it still packed a wallop on the shoreline.
And it also let us know how vulnerable our state is, whether or not it's to coastal flooding or even power outages with the tree damage that did happen.
And when this big one came down, you heard a crack, crack, then a boom. It felt like a bomb went off.
Speaking of tree damage, just 2 months after Irene, a freak October snowstorm.
So you're still having people pick up the pieces from Irene moving through. That snowstorm weighted everything down because the leaves were still on the trees.
But this is the scene here that is impacting people the most.
More than 800,000 homes and businesses lost power. Schools became shelters for people with no heat and running water. While that was going on, a jury was deciding the fate of Joshua Komisarjevsky, the other robber, killer, and rapist from the Cheshire home invasion.
We're obviously very pleased with the guilty verdicts.
In December of 2011, Komisarjevsky joined Stephen Hayes on death row. The state legislature passed a repeal of the death penalty in 2009, but Governor Rell vetoed it specifically because of the Cheshire case.
I do think it put a pause in the debate about the death penalty because there was such disgust at what these two subhumans did.
But Governor Daniel Malloy was against the death penalty. In August of 2012, he signed its repeal. It had an exemption for the men on death row, but courts later struck that down.
But those twisters do remind us.
Dr. Mel Goldstein gave the forecast every day with a smile, despite finding out in 1996 his own forecast was not good. He had blood cancer, multiple myeloma, and he was given 3 years to live. He stayed on the air for another 15.
Mel Goldstein was a tough guy. Mel Goldstein played hurt for years in the kind of pain that I don't think I could play through.
Keith was with him for his farewell forecast in November of 2011.
Connecticut has the greatest variety of weather that you could possibly ever have.
He died just 2 months later.
3.
His wife Arlene dedicated a bench to Mel on the beach in East Haven, just in time for Superstorm Sandy.
We are seeing that surge push forward, get closer to some of these homes.
It was another deal with coastal flooding, but it just depended on that wind direction of where those waves were smashed up against the homes.
I remember we got to East Haven and houses just weren't there anymore.
All the damage left behind by Sandy looked like it would be the saddest news of the year until December.
There were 18 children who were pronounced dead at the scene. There were 2 children who were transported to area hospital or pronounced dead at the hospital.
Just when you think you've seen every horrible thing that could happen, something like that happens and sets the bar at a level you can't imagine.
We can never undo the senseless tragedy that took place on December 14th.
But after what happened at Sandy Hook Elementary, Connecticut did pass new laws banning certain guns and high-capacity magazines. Almost nothing got done for a few days in February of 2013. A nor'easter dumped feet of snow. Hamden saw 40 inches. And in April, the Yukon women won their 8th national title, the start of an amazing run. In June, the run of Bristol native Aaron Hernandez was over. The Patriots tight end arrested for murder. He killed himself in prison 4 years later.
Oh, my God.
In August, a plane landing at Tweed crashed into an East Haven house. A mom and 2 children were home.
She came running out and she said her kids were in the house.
The children died, so did the father and son on the plane. In April of 2014, Yukon did it again, a double celebration as the men's and women's basketball teams won the national championship in the same year.
Remarkable.
And again in 2015, the Yukon women win their 10th national title, their 3rd in a row. A much more sinister streak was uncovered later in April. William Devon Howell was already in prison for killing one woman. Now more bodies were found behind a New Britain strip mall.
It was never, ever a cold case. It's always been a front burner, high heat case.
Howell pled guilty to killing 6 more people in Connecticut, making him the state's most prolific serial killer.
For the 4th year in a row,
And the streak continued for the Yukon women. For senior Brianna Stewart, it was 4 years in stores, 4 national titles.
The explosion was just enormous.
In October of 2016, a student pilot intentionally crashed a plane in East Hartford during a lesson. He died. The instructor barely survived. 4 months later, a plane from the same flight school crashed in a swamp in East Haven, killing the student pilot. The big story of 2018 so far was the day 4 tornadoes hit the state.
Part of it is in my yard.
They tore through yards from Brookfield to North Haven. So many people sent in amazing photos and videos, and the ability to do that has really changed the news business.
The immediacy of how we can bring people information right now, streaming, live. Everyone's got the ability to be live on television in their pocket.
Our viewers come through for us every day. It makes our coverage that much better.
The biggest change in the last 70 years may have happened in the last 10 with the rise of social media. We get to know the viewers, and viewers get to know the News 8 family, and that family feeling is one thing that has stayed the same for all these years.
The people that worked at the station very much became like family. And the viewers are very much like family.
Even to this day, I'll be in New Haven or Milford or wherever, and someone will recognize me and they'll run across the street to give me a hug.
And we hope that feeling stays the same for another 70 years.
We have an entire section on our website and our News 8 app dedicated to our 70th anniversary, which includes the half-hour special we did on our anniversary, the date June the 15th, 70 years after we turned on the switch at News 8 in 1948.
And also on our app and website, we even have more old clips from over the past 70 years, including some great promos from the 70s, 80s, and the 90s.
Thank you for joining us for our journey back in time and for your support over all these years.
Have a good evening.